Hello, hello.
Hello. And I don't know if all the viewers also had that rockin' music during the 30-second countdown, but
Oh, I hope.
getting
Yeah,
into it.
me too. I found it very energizing. Uh, you did have rocky music, wonderful. Yeah, let us all start the night that way. Um, Welcome to our panel about making games for hard conversations. We were lucky enough to also do a panel last year at Big Bad Online, except it was in the morning. So now I feel like we had like morning coffee vibes, if I'm remembering that correctly. And now we have like nighttime vibes, but particular nighttime vibes because we're
Yep,
both
we're
on.
East Coasters now, so 10 p.m. vibes.
Yeah, exactly. Where are you in the world, Hakan?
Where am I?
Yeah.
I am in Washington, D.C. on the third floor of our townhouse. What about you,
Oh,
Kate?
I am in Boston, Massachusetts, technically Cambridge, Massachusetts, not with you, as I normally would be. But instead, we at least find ourselves on the same coast because I believe last time we were on different coasts.
Were we? I forgot that. Yeah.
Mhm, mhm,
Oh,
yeah. Um, Anywho, I'm excited to talk to you about making games for hard conversations, and
mhm.
I feel like the best way to start is with like a proto game for doing conversation work, which is an icebreaker.
Yeah.
And maybe even before the icebreaker, or actually, let's do the icebreaker first, then we can introduce ourselves. Hakan, if you could play a conversation game with an animal, which animal would it be and why?
Hmm. I mean, so I was thinking about this icebreaker when you had floated it as a potential thing we would talk about, and I tried to think about the animals that seem to have the most to say to one another all the
Mm,
time, right? And I just kept coming back to birds because whenever we're walking around like the bushes in Washington D.C. and out in the wild, it seems like they're always chattering to each other. So I think probably a bird, like a small sparrow or a songbird, something like that. That's like seeing and obviously has a lot to say at all points in time. But Kate, if you were to play an icebreaker game with an animal, what animal would you play it with?
I will answer that question, but I do want to follow up on your bird comment. And
Hmm.
my follow up to that too is just that I'm surprised you didn't say the real squawky birds, like the ones that like feel like they have just a lot of moxie and nerve, like the corvids, the ones you just
Well, I don't know if I really,
you don't want
it seems like you'd have to have a lot of like personal resilience and confidence in yourself to like have a conversation with a bird like that. I feel like I'd be dealing with a lot of like jibes and foul language and stuff like that. But
yeah,
like the songbirds, they have a lot to say, but they keep it civil.
right. And they're already
But
playing games with each other.
that's true. But Catherine, if you could have a conversation with any bird, with any kind of animal, sorry, what kind of animal would it be?
Yeah, I also was thinking about this, and my first reaction was also birds. But to answer this question differently, I think I would go with whale, like a whale song. Imagining like being able to chat with a whale. I know that there are actual research projects that are trying to better understand kind of like the clicks and songs that come out of different kinds of whales. There's a project SETI, CETI, for people that are interested. I'm sure many others that are trying to decode whale language. But I feel like that whales probably already have games in their whale culture, and if we could just kind of broach a game to then be able to communicate between us, that hopefully I would get to join in, even for a small moment, in appreciating their whale culture. So that's
Yeah,
my response to that question.
it's a good one. But so we should probably introduce ourselves.
That makes sense.
So everyone, I'm Hakan. I'm one half of Thorny Games, along with Kate. We're an indie RPG studio that specializes in games that tell stories based around language in some way. And Kate.
Yep. I am Kate, or Kathryn, and I am the other half of Thorny Games. And my pronouns are she and her. And yeah, a lot of what we design as a studio has to do with language in some way. And so this idea of games as an inroad to conversation, I feel like it feels like a natural extension already of what we're doing, but it still is a little different. And so I feel like that there's some interesting things to poke at here. Yeah.
It looks like you also got a question from the chat about what the best Animorph is.
Oh, thank you, chat. Thank you, chat, for this gift. Clearly, well, the best Animorph, like for folks, clearly you know what the Animorphs are, but if you don't, it is the best series of books that one could read, either as a child, young adult, older adult, really at any time in life. 65 glorious books about teenage soldiers, guerrilla warriors, literally guerrilla warriors fighting aliens that are invading, and which turn into animals. And there are, at least for me, the right answer of Animorph is certainly Tobias, who is also known as Hawk Boy. So
Sad Bird Boy.
Sad Bird Boy, who we love so much.
All right, well, wonderful.
Thank you for that chat.
Probably a good point to segue into the topic of this talk, which is games about having hard conversations, right? And I think this is generally, Kate, a topic that I think you've thought a lot more than I have to date. I have some thoughts, but I think that this is a thing that you've been very actively working on for a little bit. So I'd love to start off with asking you, how do you think about games that facilitate conversations? Is there a certain way you categorize them? Is there different types of conversations that you think games can facilitate?
Yeah, I think that like the first way that I think about it is really just the idea of gaming as a way to have a particular kind of conversation. Either it's that you want to have a conversation with somebody, and a game will allow you to better participate in that, to make for better conversation, to have a conversation that would be hard to have otherwise. Or a game can also help practice different kinds of conversations that you want to have outside of a game, but that the game is allowing for space to play, to be vulnerable, to rehearse perhaps, and then to act outside of your little magic circle. And I think of that as being different than games, especially in this case, we're really talking about story games here, but story games that are primarily around telling amazing stories with people, which is really the majority of the games that I play and would choose to play, and also enjoy designing. But games like have so many uses, and so I think it's really exciting to think about how you might be able to use all of the benefits of play design to make certain kinds of conversations better, more accessible, more playful. And then by playing the game, you are having the conversation.
And I think there's something here though that's worth diving into, right? Because I think when you're talking about conversation here, right? Obviously, all games are conversations, right? There are multiple people talking, but I think you're making a distinction, right, between conversation as humans producing sound to each other and exchanging information, and conversation that almost sounds like a capital C conversation in some way, right?
Yeah.
Like, could you talk a little bit about that? Like, what types of conversations are we talking about? Why is that type of conversation different than the other conversation? How are you mentally separating out the two?
So you cut out a little bit at the end there, but I think I understood the gist of this question. And I think that for me, It's conversations that are around a topic of some kind. Like they're trying to produce some change in the world. Like it's a conversation that is meant to, make a connection between people. That is meant to verbalize a tricky thing. Um, you know, to perform some kind of work. And that, we all have to have those conversations all of the time in different ways. Sometimes they're more or less fun. We can have different energies for them. With certain conversation partners, they can come more easily, but constantly we're called to have particular kinds of conversation. Like one may be just the idea of getting to know someone new, right? Like you can imagine there's almost a script at a party or, in a workplace, where you need to introduce yourself. And in these kinds of conversations, you're, you know, having to represent who you are in a really short period of time. Depending on the context, you may want to try and find commonalities between people, ultimately jumpstart a relationship, but also present yourself in the way that you want to be seen. And that can be a hard conversation to have. Just as one example, I think that there are many, many others that we can and should talk about. But I think that is a nice one to start with because it is perhaps maybe the most common kind of conversation game, which is just this whole class of icebreakers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it sounds like when you're talking about conversations in this way, you're really talking about conversations that are very important to have outside of the game context, right? These are conversations that there's some value to be having, even if there wasn't a game involved at all. These are conversations that should be having. Colleagues should know each other through icebreaker games because they're going to be collaborating. We might need to be practiced in a certain activity or in having a certain type of conversation because of goals that we want to achieve outside, right? Certain conversations might be really important just to have for organizational reasons or goal setting reasons or any other thing, right? These conversations would be important to have even if a game wasn't involved. However, by putting a game there, we can facilitate having these conversations that otherwise would be hard to have, right? That kind of sounds a little bit like the distinction between a conversation that's happening in the game and the conversation that we're talking about here too, right?
Yeah, I agree.
And so why do we rely on, like, say with icebreakers, right? Like, why do you feel like those are so common? Why do you feel like they're just, virtually ubiquitous? And I mean, we just did one, right? Like, and we did one last year too, when this wasn't even the topic of conversation.
Totally.
Why are they everywhere?
One, I think it's an on-ramp to an interaction. It is a warm-up, and people have a natural sense of rhythm about how conversation goes, how things start, how relationship starts. And so I think that giving a bit of structure to that conversation starting is like a great thing that a game can provide. It's like, okay, we've decided to structure this beginning and this game, maybe it's just in the form of a question, maybe it's even an actual game, something like Two Truths and a Lie, or other kinds of conversation starters, icebreakers. Like that is just an on-ramp into whatever is happening next. And that's the way that we used it here too. It's some way of injecting play into an interaction. And once you do that, then you are being creative, you are being improvisational probably, and that means you're also being a little bit vulnerable, maybe silly with each other. And I think the other thing that it does, and that different kinds of conversation can do too, is just that it also kind of sets power dynamics differently. Like in a conversation game, you think about it in a workplace, but even at a party, you are trying to invite people in and sort of remove a hierarchy. Right? Everyone's answering the same question. We're all like taking part as players in this game. So, whatever role you are outside of this, we're all kind of opting into making power be a little bit more equal here. And what spools out after that, you will find. But I feel like icebreakers do that pretty effectively. Has that been your experience with icebreakers?
I think so. I mean, one of the things that has always struck me about icebreakers, because I also just started a new job last week, so I just played an icebreaker, like an introduction icebreaker, like yesterday. It's part of like an onboarding day. And I remember something very vivid happened during this icebreaker. It was tell us a little known fact about yourself type of icebreaker. And generally, I think the value of something like that is it lets everyone talk about themselves without feeling selfish, right? Like, I think everyone would benefit from, every so often telling their colleagues some little known fact about them, just because it helps people bond and have something to talk about and humanizes you in front of them a little bit. But unless you have the structure of games, it can feel selfish to do that, right? And so a game kind of provides the outline structure to like get people to talk about themselves in a way that otherwise would feel self-serving. It's funny how, though now I'm kind of focusing on this one particular icebreaker, because someone had an answer, and for some reason it was so memorable that it came up over and over again over the course of the day. And at some point people just talked about it for like 5 minutes. I really wanted to go to lunch, and people just kept talking about this fact, and I couldn't leave. And the fact that this lady gave about herself was that she has never in her life bought a television set, right? Apparently she just has a brother who like is very into new tech, and so he keeps buying new televisions for himself. And whenever he does, she gets his like old television. So she has a very nice television, always has had very nice televisions, but they're all hand-me-downs from her brother. For some reason, this was the kind of fact that was just like kindling for everyone else's like thoughts throughout the day.
Yeah.
And so it was, I don't know, it's just kind of funny to reflect on, because I gave a fact, no one cared. Someone else gave a fact, no one cared, everyone forgot. But this TV fact like stuck with people. Anyways, weird digression.
No, but I think that actually that's an interesting example, because there is, even though it's presented like, it's just a bunch of people asking and answering a question, it does put people on the spot. And in some ways there is a game attached to it, even if it isn't explicitly said, where, is your little known fact the juiciest, like the sweetest morsel that we will be talking about for the rest of the day. And so I feel like it's that kind of like underlying fire that also can make these games kind of painful. And Karen called out in chat too, which I agree, is that icebreakers really require buy-in and total buy-in, especially in a work context, in order to be to work. And often I feel like people, like, if anything, when you think of an icebreaker, even though they're very functional and you see them everywhere, they also kind of elicit a groan around people feeling like they're being forced into play or into roles before the actual action starts. It's interesting.
So at this point, we've talked about what using a game to have a conversation means, right? Like definitionally. What kinds of different conversations can games facilitate? Like, do you have like kind of a thought on the different types? Like if you had some taxonomy of like different types of conversations that different types of games might facilitate?
I think that this is I have examples of what are games that I think facilitate particular kinds of conversation. And at least for me, they have that I think are interesting to delve into. But I think that the question is more general, and really, I think it's a really fertile design space, which is why I think it's cool to talk about. I think we've kind of established that to be able to use games in this way. But just like think about all of these different kind of specific hard conversations you might have, and the kinds of conversation partners you might have it with, and ask yourself whether or not it makes sense for a game to help mediate that. Like we already talked about, the idea of these kinds of conversation games making the conversation itself more approachable. But, sometimes you just want to talk about something very specific, like a topic with someone. And a really nice game that helped me do this in my play experience of it was a game called Post-Human Pathways by Jason Pitt. And this is a game, at least as it was played by me and the others, was really used to like think about a particular kind of technology or innovation, and really situate it in human role-playing situations and kind of watch it change our characters over time. And so the game is very much storytelling in and of itself, but like it was also just a very cathartic way to talk about like what we were using it for, which is kind of a biological augmentation and what that might do to us, and in some ways there was CRISPR in the news. I think that there's other kind of topical things that are happening, and really maybe what we wanted to have is a conversation around thinking through just what the human implications for all of this like new strange technology was. And I think that we chose this game and went through it and played it because of in part, like it was on our minds and we wanted to talk about it, and the game allowed us to do it. I don't even know if that's a design goal of the game specifically. It's again very much a role-playing game, but it really functioned as a way to specifically talk about how technology and this kind of, for us, biological augmentation of our characters was something that scared us but excited us at the same time, and then trying to imagine that going out into the timeline as it continued to change us. So one example.
Any others?
So another maybe like flirting, which of course I can think about with Star-Crossed comes to mind by Alex Roberts. And one, you can imagine playing that game to flirt directly with somebody. You are still embodying characters in that game, and going through this flirtatious interaction. But I think the game also functions to practice flirting, and like that is a high stakes, sometimes anxiety inducing form of conversation that hopefully we can all take part in. And it's funny. I have to say just that my good friend Joe, who's also here, was part of that Post-Human Pathways game, and so I was also remembering the previous game that we just talked about. But yeah, going back to Star-Crossed, like Star-Crossed is to me like a practice session for flirting, and that's really useful. But it can also like directly achieve flirting as a part of playing the game. And then the other one that comes to mind is Treehouse Dreams by Grey Pond Games, which is just a beautiful game about getting to know people in a different way. Imagining a treehouse. Just these can be new people, familiar people, different kinds of conversations after playing than what would happen otherwise. And I think that to me is sort of like what is productive conversation as part of this like genre of games, where it's, do the players think that, do the players agree that this conversation would be hard to have outside of the game? And also, do they feel like that whatever conversation happened as a result of the game was valuable? And I think if you have both of those, you've really made something pretty cool, because then you have this conversation generator just by playing.
Yeah, and second, all of those games, really wonderful games. especially want to shout out Treehouse Dreams. Like that game is really a beautiful, beautiful game that I think a lot more folks should play. So I'd to encourage everyone to pick up a copy. And so I think those are all really great examples, right? And so we've talked a little bit about, you've talked a little bit about, I should give myself credit. Talked a lot about using games for, getting to know people, practicing skills like flirting, getting to bond and connect with people around you. But there are more situations too where people use something akin to the structure of games, right? Something like games to achieve a similar end. And so when we're talking about like using games as this conduit for having hard conversations, I think it's important for us to also talk about this adjacent space too, right? Like that's a very similar type of activity that people have been using on developing for a long time for having hard conversations as well. Could you talk about some of those examples? What are some adjacent activities that are also used to have hard conversations that might not be games, right?
Yeah. And I think a great example of this is just the practice of theater of the oppressed. So theater of the oppressed is a type of format of theater activities, performances that came out of a methodology from a Brazilian theater director and also an activist, Augusto Boal. I think that theater of the oppressed was inspired by, I'm sure, many other things that ultimately came to that input. But it was really a form of theater as activism. And here I'm looking at some notes too from a definition of the kind of theater of the oppressed that is practiced by a group in New York called Theater of the Oppressed NYC, TONYC. And they practice a type of forum theater there where actors, so people who are part of this theater troupe, will present some kind of original play that's based on a real problem that people are facing in their lives. And often they focus on problems that are around systemic oppression, power differences, using these kinds of theater games to help give voice to people that otherwise don't have, the platform in, society that they should. And one way that this format is played is that these players will set up a scenario and then invite audience members to then take part in one of these games, these theater activities, so that they can step in and play out different scenarios. Could it have gone another way? What would you say under this? If your boss is yelling back at you, or if the teacher ultimately isn't listening, or if you need to have a hard conversation with your doctor. And the idea is using play as this space to rehearse and to explore other possible solutions so that people can practice for doing this in real life, to intervene in their own lives. And so I think that is a vibrant, real kind of theater practice that is out in the world, many places, played by theater troupes in many places, and then specifically one that I have spent a little bit of time talking to in New York, and actually reported a bit on it as part of a fun news piece that maybe I will drop into chat. People want to read it. Actually, I'm going to have to drop it in. I'm going to ask a proxy to drop it in. Oh, and links may not work apparently. Well, I sent a link to a friend, and maybe that friend might hopefully get it into chat. But ultimately, this is a write-up of sort of play as rehearsal, and you know, how play can be used to facilitate particular kinds of conversations that would be really tricky. Um, and Hakan, you also got to take part in a Theater of the Oppressed workshop at some point over the pandemic that was run by TONYC.
I did. That was a wonderful experience. Yeah. And you know, I only got to try a small piece of it. Obviously, it was just a day-long workshop. I know that you've had many more conversations with them. But I think one of the things that's really important to stress about it is the reason why that work is so important is because it's preparing folks for very high stakes interactions, right?
Yeah.
Places where they're not going to get do-overs. And by using the framework of this, not a game, but structured activity, right? You're both letting them practice what they'll say, but also let them practice having agency in the situation, right? Like, let them practice what it means to be able to have control and make active decisions about how they're going to be handling it. Which is something that, you know, most situations in life, I think we end up being reactive, right? We don't end up being able to really have agency and drive motion and conversation forward according to what we need unless we are deliberate and intentional about it. And this is a place where people can practice and be prepared to exert their agency in a high stakes situation. It was how I thought of it, and really what I found was so affecting from the practice itself.
Yeah, and actually, I think it's an interesting point, and you know, for me to meditate on too, at least when it comes to the idea of embodiment around some of these conversations, because part of the use of like a part of what happens in Theater of the Oppressed, I mean, people are moving around, like in LARP sometimes, and that, you know, it's also meant to you know, stir the feelings, you know, that can be very real feelings of you know, tension, anxiety, high stakes, like you say, in someone, you know, through play, you know, so that they can confront, you know, what it is to physically engage in these kinds of conversations when they happen and occur out in the world. So play will, like, you know, can make you feel a glimpse of the feelings that would come from a real scenario. And at the same time, I also think that certain kinds of conversation games can, you know, are especially when you think about icebreakers or things like it, if they're successful, they also are kind of, you know, mellowing out some of the feelings that would happen under different kinds of you know, conversation without the structure of a game, right? You know, you may have all of these other feelings of play that are coming into your conversation and hopefully helping you have a better conversation than what you would have had without it. But it's interesting that in one side you're really trying to evoke real feelings so that then you can, you know, speak your mind and truth when the moment calls for it. And then on the other, it's, you know, thinking about how to ease a real conversation that's happening in real time. And I think part of that also depends on like whether or not a game, you know, if you are playing a game in order to have a conversation with the opposite player, right? You know, versus if you're playing a game to rehearse. We have a question. Can you share your thoughts on games' ability to enable real conversation between people with opposing views of political or other issues where their sides generally don't listen to each other? Yeah, this is a really interesting topic. And one I've started to think about. And I think that For me, there is like part of what you have to do here, or part of at least the approach that I would take, is to go back and understand, what are the elements that we know from social science, from other disciplines, prejudice reduction, from group, collaboration, from flow, that can help people have more productive conversation, even if it's, I think that there's a kind of conversation that is always going to be destructive, and those should just not happen. But if you're really, trying to facilitate a conversation with people that have different opposing views, but want to talk, want to understand, are eager to broach a pressing subject, I think that there are behaviors in conversation that you can embody that lead to better interactions. And if ultimately, if both people leave a conversation feeling like that it was valuable, even if that is the only thing that comes out of it, maybe a game, we could say that that is one success criteria for a conversation game in this way. But like when you think about the elements of productive conversation from literature, it's things like close listening. Are you actually listening to what the other person has to say? Are you giving them your concentration? Are you able to equally participate? Can you gain familiarity with one another so that you're humanized in some way? Again, primarily to see sort of the complexity of different people and what they're bringing to whatever is the topic of conversation at hand. Is there potential for failure and for pivoting, which I think is a part of what it means to try and negotiate tricky topics, and then also, do people feel like they're in control of the conversation and what's happening in it, and can they voice their disagreement in a way that is honest, and still keeps the conversation on the rails, right? Where they feel like it doesn't devolve into something that they don't want to be part of. And that is all of these are high bars to do, which is why this is hard. But I think that these are behaviors that people can have, which can be incentivized in some ways by the right kind of game mechanics. Conversation becomes truly destructive, toxic, not in good faith, then it shouldn't happen. But I think that there's a lot of conversation that could and should happen from people that have different views, but that is still really hard to have. And that it's interesting to think about how games might be, fertile design ground here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see we have another one. As a mediator, I have a strong interest in helping people develop conflict resolution skills. What games might you suggest for developing skills through play?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I wish I had a ready answer to a single game, or a set of games that might do this. Really, I mean, I think the whole practice of theater of the oppressed is where I would start more than anything else. Often, these are scenarios that are about real conflict that people encounter in their lives, their daily lives, that they're bringing to their theater troupe, and the trained folks there, jokers, know how to provoke, but still, give fertile space for people to um, de-escalate or escalate all of this, as a part of what it means to explore possible solutions through play. That's probably where I would start, but it's a great question, and one that I would want to explore more myself. So please let me know if you find some.
And I see one. Is there a place to explore issues of accountability in games? I think maybe before we answer that one, I would maybe ask the party that posed it to give us a little bit more context in terms of like what you exactly mean in terms of accountability, what type of accountability or what type of conversation about accountability it would be interesting exploring in the game, just so we can make sure that we're addressing that correctly.
Yeah.
Both another
And
practice.
the other thing that this just evokes for me, oops, sorry, you
Okay.
cut out. I didn't know if I was talking over you. I think the other thing that that question, even while we're waiting for it, evokes for me is just that there are examples of games that I think elicit bad conversation, right? And for me, that game is Cards Against Humanity as an example, and I can understand that for some people maybe that is a positive experience. I've had pushback in different ways when I've talked about it, but when I've seen that game played too often, it is a generator for really lazy racism, misogyny, just the worst parts of us, and also normalizes that in in many different settings between friends and workplaces, and it always pains me how popular that game is. And sometimes like it pains me how popular that game is for um, people who otherwise don't play games very much, and that is just their point of reference for what it is to play as an adult. And that's not to say that game, maybe didn't give good things to specific people under certain contexts, but certainly from what I've seen, that is an example of what I would call a, you know, um, toxic conversation generator.
Perfect. And are there any other points that you wanted to make, Kate, on this topic in particular?
Yeah, I think that, I guess just a point I'd love for both of us to reflect on just personally, and if anyone out there is thinking on, is just what kinds of tricky, important, meaningful conversations do we wish there were games for? Like almost even just putting out a wish list. And maybe these are like specific conversations that you've had to have, or or things that you can imagine. Yeah. One thing that comes to mind for me that is also it's kind of niche and but personal but still very relevant is that I'm pregnant right now, and there's a lot of weird negotiation around just you know talking about being pregnant to different people, and that just even verbalizing feelings myself about it, and I think that certainly there's situations where I wouldn't want that experience to be gamified, but I feel like that actually it might make a lot of things easier and better. And I know that that's a personal wish list, but it's just a very regular conversation stumbling point for me over the last number of months.
I think for me, I would love more games that genuinely allowed me to learn fun, real things and connect with my peers that I'm playing with that don't feel like they're kind of deliberate and kind of tortured attempts at doing just that, right? Like a lot of times these games that are designed to do that are like situations where there isn't a lot else that's drawing people to play the game, right? Which is why I also think that Treehouse Dreams is such a beautiful game, right? Like it's a fun activity. We're building something together, right? There's a story we're telling, and people can engage with it at the level that they feel comfortable engaging with it, right?
Mm.
But really, it's a wonderful excuse to be able to learn something more and bond with the people that you're playing with.
Yeah.
I have a hard time like thinking of a lot of other games that do that I'm excited to play. And that's just a really important activity that like I really enjoy doing. And so I'd love more games that like had more of a draw, like more of a hook into them that allowed me to have those conversations. We have a follow-up on the accountability question. Specifically, it looks like what the party was interested in was issues around dealing with harm, emotional or mental health. How do we have conversations about these circumstances to explore how to understand and feel harm? I would wish that was an answer that I had something more readily available to. If anyone in the chat has some good examples, feel free to drop them in. And I'm sure there are games that explore that topic that would help players kind of have conversations around it. But at least to me right now, I'm not thinking of a good answer to that question. So maybe someone in chat could drop some other thoughts, unless you have to indicate as well.
No, I agree with that. And again, this is an area that I would love to learn more about myself. And I think I'm sure that there's great scholarly work probably too among people in the games community that might be interesting to explore here.
Do you have
a question about?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. There's a slight delay, but yeah, I see a question about a go-to game recommended instead of Cards Against Humanity. But I see in chat, actually, I think Karen answered what I would, which is the games that are maybe even the inspiration in terms of system for that, like Apples to Apples, and that's like a light structured conversation game around that. But the other game that I just that I also feel like it does such brilliant things around just matching of prompts is Fall of Magic. It's not necessarily a conversation game, but when I think of just like the beauty of putting two things together next to one another, like you give a location and then a small prompt and just like magic happens. I'm sure that you can use that game probably if you set it up as a conversation game too. But I agree with Karen's recommendations here.
And have you tried any negotiation board games like Catan in its simple form, but like sidereal confluence at its apotheosis?
I don't know the second game, but I've played so much Catan with you, Hakan. And I know that it's a favorite of yours because of all of the negotiation that happens there. I feel like that this is also a moment for you potentially to share a brief anecdote about the conversation LARPing that you got to do for a business school at some point.
Oh yeah, I remember that. Well, I know we're almost out of time too, but one of my fun activities in grad school was they would always need someone, the business school at UCLA, for their like business negotiation class would always need like someone to play the other side of the students. So like as the students were learning how to negotiate, like they would need someone who wasn't a student in the class to like be the other party in it. So I remember volunteering for that a couple of times. It was always very fun. Mainly because the kids really didn't understand the like emotional part of negotiation, I think, until they like actually got to be there. And so like I remember the very first one I did, these kids, they were like going to build a factory next to my farmland that was going to render it worthless, but they wanted to buy it from me. And it was worth like some marginal amount for them. And they just came into the room and offered me $1 for it because it was going to be worthless otherwise. And I just told them to like get the hell out of the room and that like I'd see the lands burn to dust before I would ever let them touch it or something. And we got to a more reasonable place. But that was always a lot of fun. Anyways, we are being told we're at time. It was wonderful talking to you folks, and hope that there's some good post discussion as well. Some folks who might have other suggestions for games. So.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for joining, and thank you, Hakan, for being my conversation partner in all of this.
Take care.